She didn't knock. She just walked in like she owned the place. Vivian Blackridge, silk dress pressed sharp enough to cut glass, eyes sweeping across Evelyn's kitchen with the kind of slow contempt that takes years to perfect. She picked up a clay mug from the table, turned it over once, set it back down like it offended her. Then she looked at Evelyn, really looked at her, and smiled. Not a friendly smile, the kind rich women save for people they've already decided don't matter. "Enjoy it while it lasts, sweetheart," Vivian said, "because in 6 months, everything you're standing in will belong to me." Evelyn didn't move, didn't flinch, but her hands, hidden behind her back, were shaking. If you've ever had someone look at everything you'd fought to build and tell you it meant nothing, you already know exactly how this story feels. Stay with me, because this one doesn't end the way Vivian expected. And before we go any further, if stories about courage, stubborn love, and justice hitting hard find a home in your heart, please subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button. And drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Callan Mercer would later decide was the cruelest possible day for a life to change. Not a Monday, when a man's guard is already up. Not a Friday, when there's at least the excuse of the week being finished. Tuesday. The middle of everything and the edge of nothing. He found it tucked under a stone on his porch step, which meant someone had walked up to his door and left without knocking, which meant either they were afraid of him or they were in too much of a hurry to wait. He looked out across the yard, saw only the tree line and the gray morning sky pulling itself apart at the horizon, and bent down to pick it up. The handwriting on the outside read, "Callan, from Thomas." He stared at that for a long moment. His thumb pressed the edge of the envelope without opening it. Thomas Ashcroft had been dead for 4 months. He'd heard through a passing supply rider, the way most news traveled out here. Too late, too brief, delivered between other mundane things so you barely had time to react before the man was already gone and the conversation had moved on to grain prices. Callan sat down on the porch step. He didn't go inside. He opened the letter there in the cold morning air because somehow that felt more appropriate. Standing up felt too formal. Sitting inside felt too sheltered. Thomas deserved to be read in the same kind of air the man had always lived in. Unprotected, wide open. The letter was 2 pages. The handwriting started controlled and grew shaky toward the bottom, the way sick men's handwriting does. And Callan read it slow, twice, because some sentences didn't settle right the first time through. "I'm writing this knowing I won't be around to ask you in person, which I consider a coward's way of asking a favor, and I'm sorry for that. But you're the only man I trust with what I'm about to tell you, so here it is, plain. My daughter Evelyn has nobody left. Not a cousin, not a neighbor, who'll take her in without wanting something for it. The debts from my illness ate through everything I'd set aside for her. By the time this letter finds you, she'll have lost the house, and I expect she'll be too proud to tell anyone how bad it truly is. She gets that from her mother. God rest her. I know what I'm asking isn't small. I know you've got your reasons for living the way you do. But Callan, you are a decent man, and I owe you my life twice over, and I wouldn't ask this if there was anyone else. Look after her. Whatever form that takes, I trust your judgment more than my own at this point. Don't let her starve trying to prove she doesn't need help." Thomas Callan folded the letter. He put it in his shirt pocket, against his chest, which was a thing he'd never done with a piece of paper before in his life. He sat there another 10 minutes doing absolutely nothing except watching a sparrow pick at something in the dirt near the fence post. Then he went inside and put a second cup on the shelf next to his. She arrived 3 days later on the back of the afternoon stage, which stopped at the crossroads a mile from his property and didn't wait. Callan had driven his wagon out to meet it more out of logistics than anything he'd been ready to call kindness. He stood by the wheel and watched the passengers climb down, and he knew her immediately. Not because they'd met before, they hadn't, not once, but because she carried herself the way Thomas had described once, years ago. Evelyn walks into a room like she already knows she's going to have to fight someone in it. She was tall, not unusually so, but enough that she met his eyes without having to tilt her chin up, which seemed to throw her slightly when she registered it. She was wearing a coat that had been fine once and was doing its best to still look it. She had a single travel bag and a wooden box under one arm that she wouldn't let the stage driver take even when he offered. Her jaw was set in a way that looked like it had been set like that for some time and might need medical attention to unclench. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "Miss Ashcroft." They shook hands, businesslike. Her grip was firm and brief, the kind of handshake that says, "I am not here to be underestimated before a single word of real conversation has happened." "My father's letter," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "You don't have to do anything he asked." She said it cleanly, without bitterness, though something behind her eyes was working very hard. "I want to be clear about that before either of us wastes time being polite about something you'd rather not do. If you read it and felt obligated, I release you from that. I'll find another arrangement." Callan looked at her. He thought about Thomas Ashcroft pulling him out of a flooded ravine in the spring of '74, and again talking a very drunk and angry man out of shooting Callan in the back of the head outside a trading post in '79, and the way Thomas had done both things without once mentioning it afterward, like it was just something you did when you happened to be nearby. "Get in the wagon," he said. She opened her mouth. "Please," he added, because Thomas probably would have wanted him to say that. She got in the wagon. Whoops. They rode in silence for a stretch that would have been uncomfortable between most people and was merely honest between them. The land out here didn't fill silence the way towns did. It just held it, spread it out, let it breathe. Callan had learned to find that restful. I wasn't sure yet what Evelyn made of it. "My father talked about you," she said eventually. "Thomas talked about most things. He said you saved each other's lives more than once. He saved mine more than I saved his, but he had a way of keeping score differently." She looked at him sideways. "He also said you were stubborn as Riverstone and twice as difficult to move." Callan considered that. "That's fair." He said it like it was a compliment. Thomas had unusual standards. Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, but its first cousin. It lasted about 2 seconds, and then the set jaw came back. He noticed she was gripping the side of the wagon seat and looking at the landscape with the particular expression of someone who is refusing to look at their own feelings. "I don't intend to be a burden," she said. "Whatever you offered, I'll work. I know how to keep accounts. I know basic medicine. I can cook adequately, though I won't pretend I'm exceptional at it. Adequately is fine. I've been cooking for myself for 11 years. My standard isn't high." That's somewhat reassuring and somewhat alarming. Most honest things are. She was quiet a moment, then, "What exactly did you offer?" "The letter I received from your solicitor in town was brief." "I offered a practical arrangement," he said. "Legal marriage, shared household. You'd have a home and standing in the territory. I'd have—" He paused, not because he didn't know the word, but because he was deciding how plainly to say it. "Company, and someone capable of managing things I'm not patient enough to manage well. You want a business partner. I want someone I don't have to explain the situation to 12 times before they understand it." She looked at him fully then, for the first time since the wagon started moving. "My father said you'd say something like that." "What else did he say?" "He said—" She stopped, looked away again, swallowed once, controlled. "He said you were the kind of man who means what he says, and that you'd never once asked anything from him that you weren't willing to give back double." Callan didn't say anything to that. "I think he was trying to tell me I could trust you," she said, quieter. "You can decide that for yourself." "I know." Another pause. "But it helps that he said it." They didn't speak again until the cabin came into view, and when it did, Evelyn looked at it for a long moment without saying anything. He watched her take in the porch, the yard, the barn, the fence line that needed replacing in 2 sections. He watched her face move through something he couldn't read entirely. Adjustment, maybe, or the specific grief of a person accepting that this was what life had become and deciding, in real time, whether to be defeated by it. She wasn't. He could see that happen. The shoulders settled, the chin leveled. "It'll need work," she said. "Most things worth keeping do." "I meant the east fence section." "I know what you meant." She almost smiled again. It almost stuck this time. The wedding happened 6 days later at the county clerk's office in town, witnessed by the clerk himself, an elderly man named Horace who smelled like pipe tobacco and appeared to be only partially awake, and a woman named Della who ran the dry goods store and had driven past at the right moment and been pressed into service because they needed 2 witnesses and Callan didn't particularly want to owe anyone a favor over it. Della cried anyway. She cried at the reading of any legal document, she explained later, not just weddings. It was a medical condition. Nobody questioned this. Evelyn wore her good dress, which was the same dress she'd arrived in but pressed. Callan wore his cleanest shirt, which was a different shirt than his usual shirt, which he considered effort. The ceremony lasted 9 minutes. The clerk mispronounced Mercer on the second reading and didn't correct himself. Callan signed the certificate. Evelyn signed the certificate. Horace stamped something with more force than strictly necessary. "Congratulations," said Della, wiping her eyes. "Thank you," said Evelyn. Callan said nothing, but he held the door for her on the way out, and she noticed, and neither of them said anything about it, which felt like the right way for it to go. On the ride home, Evelyn held the wooden box on her lap the same way she had on the stage. He'd noticed she hadn't unpacked it since arriving. "What's in there?" he asked. It was the first personal question he'd asked her. She was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then, "His letters. All of them he ever sent me. And a photograph. And the deed to a property that doesn't exist anymore. A breath. And a pocket watch that stopped working 3 years ago, but I can't make myself leave it behind." Colin didn't say he understood. He didn't say he was sorry. He just nodded once, because those were the kinds of things that didn't need commentary, and Thomas's daughter was clearly the kind of woman who knew the difference. The first weeks were awkward, in the particular way that two strangers sharing a small space are always awkward, which is to say, not dramatically or unpleasantly, but with the constant low-level effort of two people trying to take up exactly the right amount of room and not always getting the calibration right. She reorganized the kitchen on day 3 without asking, which startled him mainly because he hadn't realized the kitchen had ever been organized in the first place. He came in to find his tools for cooking sorted by function and his dry goods arranged by frequency of use, and he stood there looking at it for a moment with the feeling of someone who has found a thing they didn't know was missing. "If it bothers you, I can put it back," she said without turning around from where she was writing something in a small ledger. "No," he said. No. "I need to understand the household accounts," she said. "I've looked at what you have written down and I want to be direct with you. You are not managing this land anywhere near its potential. You're leaving money sitting in the ground." He pulled out a chair and sat down. "All right. You have the water access, the soil quality, the growing season. But you're running a third of the acreage you could be. And your arrangement with the Hendersons for grazing rights is priced at what this land was worth 8 years ago. The Hendersons are decent people. I'm sure they are. They're also paying you 1863 rates in 1881. Being decent doesn't mean you can't renegotiate." She finally turned. "I'm not suggesting you take advantage of anyone. I'm suggesting you stop allowing people to take advantage of you." He looked at her. She looked back, pen still in hand, ledger open, waiting to see which direction he'd fall. "What would you change first?" he asked. She pulled the ledger around and showed him. He leaned in. She walked him through it, clearly, without condescension, without the particular tone of someone performing intelligence. Just efficient, clean. The way someone talks when they actually know the thing they're talking about and don't need anyone to be impressed by it. Thomas had called her sharp. Thomas, it turned out, had been underselling her. By the end of the first month, the farmhouse felt different in a way Callan couldn't have put precise language to. Not louder, exactly. Not warmer in any obvious way. The fire burned the same, the walls were the same walls. But there was the sound of another person moving through the morning. The smell of coffee made before he woke up. A lamp burning in the front room when he came in late. Small things. The kind of things you don't know you've been missing until they're there, and you catch yourself pausing in the doorway and feeling something shift in your chest that you don't entirely have a name for. He didn't name it. That felt premature and also somewhat terrifying. Evelyn, for her part, was adapting to the frontier with a thoroughness that should have surprised him more than it did. She got thrown off the roan mare twice in the same afternoon and got back on both times without being asked and without swearing, which he personally found impossible and respected immensely. She drove the wagon into town alone for supplies on a day when he had fence repairs that couldn't wait, came back with everything on the list, and 2 things she'd noticed they were low on that he hadn't written down. She introduced herself to the neighboring families with the same direct handshake she'd given him on day 1, and within 3 weeks the Hendersons' daughter was visiting the farm on Saturdays, because she and Evelyn had found some shared territory around medicinal herbs that had apparently turned into a full collaboration. She was building something. He could see it happening, the same way you could see spring coming if you knew where to look. Quietly, incrementally, and then all at once. He came in from the barn late on a Thursday and found her asleep at the table, head resting on her forearm, the ledger still open in front of her with a column of numbers half completed. The lamp had burned low. There was ink on her left hand. The wooden box sat on the shelf above the kitchen window, where she'd finally, somewhere in the third week, taken it out of her room and set it in the common space. He wasn't sure if she'd noticed that she'd done it. He blew out the lamp, left a blanket folded on the chair next to her, went to bed. He lay in the dark listening to the wind in the eaves, which had always been a sound he associated with solitude and now sounded very slightly like something else. He didn't name that either, but he didn't try to talk himself out of it. The trouble arrived the way trouble usually does out here, wearing a polite face and speaking in reasonable tones. Her name was Vivian Blackridge, and she came to the farm on a clear October morning in a carriage that cost more than most men in the territory earned in a year. She'd sent no notice. She just arrived, the way people do when they want to see what they can catch you unprepared for. Callan was in the barn when he heard the carriage. By the time he got to the yard, Evelyn was already standing on the porch, which he'd have found reassuring except that Vivian was already out of the carriage and approaching the steps with the particular walk of a woman who has never once been told she couldn't have something and has mistaken that for a character trait. "Mrs. Mercer," Vivian said, like the title was a mildly amusing experiment. "I don't think we've had the pleasure." "No," said Evelyn. "We haven't." Callan came up beside Evelyn. Vivian turned her attention to him briefly, then back to Evelyn, which was itself a kind of statement. "I'm here with a neighborly offer," Vivian said. "I've been trying to expand my property north, and Mr. Mercer's acreage would suit me well. I imagine a fair price would allow you both to settle somewhere a great deal more comfortable." "We're comfortable where we are," Evelyn said. "I'm sure it feels that way." Vivian smiled. "But I wonder if you've considered the full picture. Running a farm this size, the water questions that have been raised about this section of the creek. It's a great deal of uncertainty for a new household." Callan had been very still. Now he spoke. "There are no water questions about this creek. The rights have been settled since 1876. "Oh, certainly, that's how it appears." Vivian tilted her head. "But appearances and documents can be complicated. I'd hate for you both to find that out the hard way." She left shortly after, declining the offer of coffee she'd never intended to accept, climbing back into the carriage with the smooth efficiency of someone who has completed a task they came to complete. The carriage disappeared down the road, and the yard was quiet again. Callan looked at Evelyn. Evelyn watched the road where the carriage had gone, and the jaw was back. Set hard, set sure, the way he'd seen it set on the wagon that first day. But something else was in her face now, too. Not fear. He looked carefully and confirmed it was not fear. It was recognition, like someone who has seen this kind before and already knows exactly what comes next. "She's not going to stop at one visit," Evelyn said quietly. "No," Callan agreed. "Then we need to be ready before she comes back." He looked at her sideways. "What kind of ready?" She turned and met his eyes, and whatever she'd been the day she arrived, uncertain, braced, too proud for her own good and carrying her whole collapsed life in a wooden box. This was something different. This was a woman who had found her ground and intended to keep it. "The kind that doesn't need a gun," she said. Evelyn didn't sleep well that night. Not because of fear. She'd already made her peace with the fact that Vivian Blackridge was going to be a problem, but because her mind wouldn't stop working, turning the visit over and over like a stone you keep finding new edges on. She lay in the dark, listening to the wind and thinking about the way Vivian had said water questions like it was a casual thing, a minor detail, when every person who'd spent 10 minutes on working land knew that water wasn't a detail. Water was everything. Water was the difference between a farm and a graveyard of dead crops and broken intentions. She got up before dawn. She didn't bother with a lamp. She'd learned the layout of the kitchen well enough by now to move through it in the dark, which was a small thing but felt like a measure of something. She put the coffee on and sat down at the table with the household ledger and a separate notebook she'd started keeping her own notes in. Observations, questions, things that needed following up. She opened it to a clean page and wrote 2 words at the top: water rights. Then she sat there with her coffee and started thinking. Callan found her like that an hour later when he came in from checking on the horses. He looked at the notebook, looked at her, poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat down across the table without being asked. "You couldn't sleep either," she said. It wasn't a question. "I slept fine," he said. "I just wake up early." "Since when?" "Since always." She looked at him. He looked back with the particular expression she'd come to recognize, the one that wasn't exactly a wall but was at least a closed door, not hostile, just private. She was learning not to push those. Thomas had described him once in a letter as a man who'll tell you everything eventually, but needs to arrive at it himself, and she'd filed that away as useful information. "I want to see the original water rights documentation," she said. "It's in the box under the bed. The tin box, not the wood one." "How old is it?" The claim was filed in 1876, renewed in 1878. He took a slow drink of coffee. "Thomas helped me with the paperwork on the renewal." He knew the county clerk. At the mention of her father, something moved across Evelyn's face. Not grief exactly, more like the shadow grief makes when it passes overhead. She wrote the dates down. "And you've had no dispute since?" "None. Nobody ever contested it." He paused. "Until apparently now." "She didn't contest it. She suggested it might be contestable. There's a difference." Evelyn tapped her pen against the notebook. "She's testing. She came out here to see how we'd react, whether we'd look worried, whether she'd see something she could use." A beat. "Did she see anything she could use?" Callan thought about it with the same unhurried seriousness he applied to most things. Maybe." "What did she see?" "She saw a farm that's still getting its footing. She saw a new arrangement that probably looks uncertain from the outside. And she saw—" He stopped. "What?" He looked at her steadily. "She saw that I was standing next to you when I answered her, not in front of you." Evelyn was quiet for a moment, processing what that meant coming from him, what he'd noticed, what he thought Vivian had noticed. "You think she'll try to use me, come at it through me?" "She's a woman who's used to other women either being allies or obstacles. She'll try to figure out which one you are." "She already decided," Evelyn said. "The moment she called me Mrs. Mercer in that tone, she decided." She closed the notebook. "Good, good. I'd rather she underestimate me than not think about me at all." Callan watched her over his coffee cup. "Thomas told me you were the smartest person he'd ever known." He was biased. He wasn't wrong about people. She looked down at the table. "No," she said after a moment. "He wasn't." They sat in that quiet for a little while, which was one of the things Evelyn had noticed about this arrangement from early on, that the silences between them were never uncomfortable in the way silences between strangers usually are. They were just pauses, space for the next thing. "I'll get the tin box after breakfast," Callan said. "Thank you." He nodded once, got up, refilled his coffee, and that was that. The documentation was intact, which was the first good thing, and more detailed than Evelyn had expected, which was the second. Whoever had helped Thomas file the 1878 renewal had known what they were doing. The boundaries were clearly marked, the creek access specified with enough precision that ambiguity would require actual fabrication to manufacture, not just creative interpretation. She read it twice, then a third time, and then she sat back and thought about the specific way Vivian had said water questions that have been raised. Raised. By whom? When? In what form? She put the documentation back and drove into town alone that afternoon, telling Callan she needed to check at the county office on a few things. He didn't ask which things. She appreciated that. The county clerk's office was a single-room building at the far end of Main Street that smelled like dust and old paper and the specific exhaustion of underpaid civil servants. The clerk on duty was a young man named Percy, who had the look of someone who had expected a different life and was still in the process of adjusting his expectations. He was polite enough when she introduced herself and explained what she was looking for. "Any recent filings related to water rights on the creek properties north of town," she said. "Particularly anything filed in the last," she considered, 8 months. Percy looked slightly uncomfortable in a way that told her there was something to find. "I'd have to pull the records." "I'd appreciate that." He pulled them. It took a while. Evelyn stood at the counter and waited with her hands folded and her face pleasant and her mind very focused, because there was information in this room and she intended to leave with it. When Percy came back, he had a folder. He set it on the counter with the reluctance of someone delivering unwelcome news. "There are 2 filings," he said, "both within the last 6 months. Objections to existing claims, including one for the property registered under Callan Mercer." He paused. "The objections were filed by a representative of Black Ridge Ranch." Evelyn's expression didn't change. "Who specifically?" "A man named Dale Pruitt. He's listed as a legal agent." "I don't know that name." "He's not from the territory. From what I understand, he comes up from the capital when Mrs. Blackridge has legal business that needs—" Percy seemed to search for a word that wasn't too direct. "Specialized handling." "Specialized," Evelyn repeated. He filed the objection citing discrepancies in the original 1876 survey boundary. "What discrepancies?" "The filing claims the survey line was drawn incorrectly and that a portion of the creek access falls within Blackridge property rather than Mercer property." Evelyn looked at him carefully. "Percy," she said, in the tone of someone about to ask a question that requires a straight answer, "have you looked at both sets of documents?" He shifted slightly. "It's not really my place to— I'm not asking for a legal opinion. I'm asking whether you, personally, having seen both the original filing and the objection, think the discrepancy looks like a genuine error or like a document that was constructed to look like a genuine error." Percy glanced toward the back of the office, then back at her. Very quietly, he said, "The 1876 survey is consistent with every other survey filed that year. The Blackridge objection references a source document I haven't been able to locate in our records." Meaning the source document may not exist. He didn't answer that. But he also didn't disagree. "May I make copies of what was filed?" she asked. "You're the party named in the claim. You have the right to copies." He paused. "It'll take me about an hour." "I'll wait," Evelyn said. She sat down in the single wooden chair against the wall and waited. And while she waited, she thought about Dale Pruitt and non-existent source documents and the expression on Vivian Blackridge's face when she'd said appearances and documents can be complicated. Not a threat? Not exactly. A preview. The thing about previews was that they worked both directions. She left the county office with copies of everything, folded into her coat pocket, and drove home through the early evening light with the particular sensation of someone who has confirmed what they suspected and is now deciding exactly what to do about it. Callan was fixing the section of fence near the north pasture when she got back. She walked out to him rather than waiting, which he noticed. She didn't usually interrupt work in progress. He looked at her face and set down the fencing tool. "What did you find?" She told him. All of it. She watched his jaw tighten when she got to the part about the source document that didn't exist, and she watched his eyes go still in the particular way she'd come to recognize as him being very controlled about something he was actually very angry about. "So she filed a false claim," he said. "She filed an objection built on a document that either doesn't exist or was fabricated. Whether it's technically false depends on a lawyer." She paused. "But yes, that's what it looks like." He was quiet a moment. "I'll ride to town tomorrow. There's a man—" "Callan," she said it evenly. "I want to handle the legal piece." He looked at her. "I'm not asking you to step aside on the whole thing," she said. "But the documents are where I can actually help. I know how these filings work. My father taught me." She slowed slightly on father and moved through it. "He taught me how to read county records when I was 12 years old because he said a woman who can't read her own legal documents is a woman who will always need someone else to protect her from them." Callan thought about that for a moment. "All right," he said. "I'll need access to everything filed on this property, going back to the original claim. Everything you have." "The tin box has most of it. There might be some older papers in the trunk in the back room." "I'll start tonight." He nodded, picked up the fencing tool. Then, without turning around, "He was right." "My father?" "About the documents." He went back to the fence. "And about you." Evelyn stood there a moment in the fading light, feeling something in her chest that she couldn't have named cleanly, some combination of grief and gratitude and a stubborn, inconvenient warmth. Then she went inside and got to work. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that was different from the rhythm of the first month, less tentative, more purposeful, with the particular tension of 2 people who know something is coming and are choosing to spend the waiting time building rather than worrying. Evelyn spread the documents across the kitchen table every evening after dinner and worked through them systematically. Callan would sometimes sit across from her reading or sharpening something or doing the kind of quiet tasks hands find when minds are occupied. And occasionally she'd ask him a question about a date or a neighbor's property line, and he'd answer without looking up. And occasionally he'd look over and she'd walk him through what she'd found without being asked. And it was, she thought one evening, without meaning to think it, the most comfortable arrangement she'd ever known. She caught herself thinking that and filed it away under not yet. There were practical problems accumulating alongside the legal ones. Two of their neighbors, the Kellermans to the east, and a bachelor farmer named Sutter who ran sheep on the ridge, mentioned separately that they'd been approached by someone from Black Ridge Ranch asking about their plans for the season. The Kellerman visit had been almost friendly. Sutter's had been less so. He came by the farm on a Saturday to say so in person, standing in the yard with his hat in his hands, and an expression that sat somewhere between embarrassed and uneasy. Fellow said if I sign a grazing agreement with Black Ridge rather than continuing to split the upper ridge with Mercer, the terms would be considerably more favorable, Sutter said, addressing mostly the middle distance between Callan and Evelyn. Implied that Mercer's water situation was uncertain, and I'd be better off on the right side of it before things got settled. Callan's face was very still. What did you tell him? Told him I'd think about it. Sutter finally met Callan's eyes, direct and a little uncomfortable. Which is different from saying yes. I want you to know that. I know. But I also want to be straight with you. My flock had a bad spring. I can't afford to back the wrong horse if this turns into a real dispute. Evelyn spoke before Callan could. Mr. Sutter, the water claim Black Ridge filed is built on a source document that either doesn't exist or was manufactured. I have copies of the filing, and I'm in the process of establishing that. She said it without heat, just fact, the way you'd tell someone the weather. If the claim has no legal foundation, which I believe it doesn't, then there's no dispute to back a side on. There's just an attempt at intimidation that didn't succeed. Sutter looked at her properly for the first time. You know the law? I know the documents. The law follows the documents. He turned his hat in his hands a couple of rotations. How long before you know for certain? 2 weeks, maybe 3. He nodded slowly. I'll hold off on any decisions till then. He put his hat back on, looked at Callan. For what it's worth, I've never had a neighbor who didn't deal fair with me. Not going to throw that away on a rich woman's say-so without a better reason. After he left, Callan and Evelyn stood in the yard in the quiet for a moment. 2 weeks, Callan said. Is that accurate? More or less. She squinted at the ridge. I need to find out who surveyed the original 1876 boundary. If the surveyor is still alive and willing to make a statement, it closes the case on the source document question faster than anything else. Tom Breck did the survey work out here in '76. I remember because he complained about the creek flooding the whole time he was working. A pause. He retired out near Fallow Crossing. His son runs a mill out there. Evelyn looked at him. You know where he is? I know where he was 2 years ago. Word was he was still sharp. Can you write him? I can do better than that. I need to pick up supplies from Fallow Crossing anyway. Been putting it off. He looked at the ridge where Sutter had gone, then back at her. I could go Monday. It was the most direct she'd heard him offer something, not waiting to be asked, not hedging it with conditions. Just, I can do that. Monday, she said. Yes. He left Monday morning before first light. Evelyn watched the wagon disappear down the road, and then turned back to the house and the documents and the particular quality of silence that a space acquires when the other person in it is gone and you notice, more than you expected to, that they're not there. She worked through the morning. She found 2 additional problems in the Black Ridge filing by mid-afternoon. Inconsistencies in the dates that, taken together, made it very difficult to believe the reference survey had been completed when it claimed to have been. She wrote it all out carefully in her notebook, sourced to the specific documents, with the precision of someone who knew that clear evidence was only useful if it was also readable by people who hadn't been living inside it for weeks. She also, that afternoon, took the roan mare out for an hour because the work was making her tense, and riding was one of the few things that genuinely cleared her head even when it wasn't going smoothly, and the roan was still not completely convinced about Evelyn, and they were still in an ongoing negotiation about it, which was fine. Evelyn respected a horse that had opinions. She got back to the farm in the late afternoon, put the mare in the barn, and was walking back to the house when she saw the other horse tied to her porch post. She didn't recognize the horse, but she recognized the woman sitting in the chair on her porch, waiting with the composed patience of someone who had arranged themselves there deliberately and didn't particularly mind being found. Vivian Blackridge stood when she heard Evelyn coming. She was dressed more casually than the first visit, or what passed for casual at that level of wealth, which still meant finely made clothes and hair arranged with intention. She had a small smile prepared. "Mrs. Mercer," she said, "I hope you don't mind me waiting." "Not at all," said Evelyn, which was not true, but whose business was that. "I was hoping to catch you alone, actually." The smile held. Woman to woman. "My husband is away until evening." She kept her voice easy. "Come in. I'll put on coffee." Inside, Evelyn moved through the kitchen with her back to Vivian for just long enough to settle herself, to put her hands through the familiar motions of the coffee pot and the cups, and remind herself of the ground she was standing on. Her ground. Her kitchen. Her cups. Then she turned and sat across the table from Vivian Blackridge and waited. Vivian looked around the room with the same careful attention she'd given it on the first visit. Her eyes rested briefly on the wooden box on the shelf, moved to the documents stacked on the side of the table, moved back to Evelyn. "I came to make you a more direct offer," Vivian said. "The land isn't for sale," Evelyn said. "I'm not talking about the land." Vivian tilted her head, and the smile changed into something harder underneath. "I'm talking about your situation, specifically." "My situation seems fine to me." "Evelyn?" The use of the first name was deliberate, intimate, diminishing. "I know what this marriage is. I know it started as an arrangement. I know Callan Mercer has lived alone on this property for over a decade, and that you arrived less than 2 months ago with nothing." A pause calibrated for impact. "I'm not judging that. I'm simply saying that you have options that don't require you to stay in a difficult situation out of some misplaced loyalty." Evelyn looked at her steadily. "What options?" "I have properties. I have need for women of intelligence in administrative roles. If you are willing to provide a statement regarding the water rights, confirming that the original filing may have been inaccurate, that there was confusion at the time, I would ensure you were placed and compensated generously, independently." She leaned forward slightly. "You'd owe nothing to anyone." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Evelyn looked down at her coffee cup. She turned it once in her hands. Then she looked back up at Vivian Blackridge, and she thought about her father writing that letter in a handwriting that had gone shaky at the bottom. And she thought about Callan holding the door at the county clerk's office. And she thought about Sutter turning his hat in his hands and saying, "I've never had a neighbor who didn't deal fair with me." "You came into my home," Evelyn said, "and asked me to commit fraud against my husband. I asked you to consider your independence. You asked me to sign a false statement so you could steal our water rights. That's what you asked." She set the cup down. "And you dressed it up as doing me a favor." Something shifted in Vivian's face. The smoothness cracked at the edges just slightly, and underneath was something colder and more direct. "You're being foolish." "Maybe." Evelyn stood. "But I'd rather be foolish on my own land than comfortable on yours." She walked to the door and opened it. "I think we're finished." Vivian stood slowly. She took her time about it, the way people do when they want you to understand they are choosing to leave rather than being dismissed. At the door she paused, and the cold thing in her face had settled into something controlled again, something arranged. "I've dealt with stubborn people before," she said. "I know," said Evelyn, "and yet here you are on my porch, still trying." Vivian left. The horse picked its way down the road. Evelyn stood in the doorway and watched until it was gone. And then she closed the door and stood in her kitchen with both hands braced on the table, breathing deliberately, in and out, because her hands were shaking again, and she preferred that to happen in private. Then she straightened up and sat back down with the documents, because the work wasn't finished, and she didn't have the time to fall apart over a woman who'd counted on her having nothing worth standing up for. Callan came back late that evening, later than she'd expected, and she heard the wagon and went to the door. Unhitched the horse and came up to the porch with the look of someone who'd had a long day and covered a lot of ground and was deciding how to report on it. "Tom Breck is alive," he said. "He's 71 and his hip is bad, and he's opinionated about surveying equipment in a way I cannot fully explain. But he is alive and sharp, and when I described the claim Blackridge filed and read him the parts about the survey boundary, he got very quiet and then he got very loud. Loud how? Loud in the way of a man who has spent 40 years doing careful work and has just been told someone forged it. Callan came inside, sat down, accepted the plate she'd kept warm for him without comment. He'll put it in writing. He wants to put it in writing. He asked me 3 separate times if we had a lawyer, and when I said not yet, he told me to get one. He's right. We should. She sat down across from him. Vivian came by while you were gone. He looked up from his plate. She offered me a job, Evelyn said, on the condition that I provided a statement confirming the water rights filing might have been inaccurate. Callan set down his fork. I told her to leave, Evelyn said. She went. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not surprise exactly. Something more careful than surprise. She thought you'd take it, he said. She thought I had nothing to stay for. He was quiet for a moment. Then, in the particular tone of a man choosing his words with more care than he usually applied, Do you? She met his eyes, held them. Yes, she said, simply, plainly. I do. Something in his face shifted. The closed door, just slightly, opened. He didn't say anything. But he didn't look away either, and for Callan Mercer, she was beginning to understand that meant something. They sat there in the lamplight with dinner between them and a forged land claim and a stubborn old surveyor and a growing list of things that needed doing, and outside the wind was picking up from the north the way it did before the real cold set in, and none of it was resolved and none of it was simple. And Evelyn thought, not for the first time, that Thomas had known exactly what he was doing when he wrote that letter. She just wasn't sure yet how much he'd seen coming. The lawyer's name was Edmund Hare, and he operated out of a narrow office above the feed store in town that smelled like sawdust and old coffee, and the particular mustiness of a man who read too much and aired out his space too rarely. He was 50-something, lean in the way of men who forget to eat when they're working, with spectacles that he wore pushed up on his forehead more often than on his nose, which suggested either vanity or absent-mindedness. And after 20 minutes with him, Evelyn concluded it was neither. He simply thought better without them, and read better with them, and had given up pretending there was a system. He listened to everything without interrupting, which she respected. She laid out the documents in the order she'd organized them, walked him through the inconsistencies in the Blackridge filing, showed him her notes on the date discrepancies, and told him about Tom Breck and the written statement that was coming by post from Fallow Crossing. Colin sat in the second chair and said almost nothing, which was also the right choice, not because he had nothing to offer, but because he understood, as he seemed to understand most things, when a situation called for him to be present rather than central. When she finished, Hare pushed his spectacles up and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at her. Miss Ashcroft, Mrs. Mercer, where did you learn to read a land filing? My father was a careful man who didn't trust other people to be careful on his behalf, she said. He taught me what he knew. He taught you well. Hare pulled the date inconsistency page toward him and looked at it again. This alone isn't enough to have the claim dismissed, but this combined with a surveyor's statement from the original filing, that's a different conversation. He tapped the paper. The question is whether Pruitt anticipated someone reading it this carefully. I think he expected the intimidation to work before it got to the reading stage, Evelyn said. Hare smiled, which rearranged his face into something warmer. That's usually how these things are designed. He leaned back in his chair. I'll file a formal response to the objection this week. In the meantime, I want everything you have copied and stored somewhere other than your house. Callan spoke for the first time in 20 minutes. Why? Hare looked at him evenly. Because in my experience, when a wealthy person's legal strategy stops working, they move to other strategies, and documents have a way of disappearing before cases go to hearing. He said it without drama, just professional observation, the same tone he'd used to note that it might rain. I'm not predicting anything. I'm suggesting precautions. On the ride home, Evelyn sat with her hands in her lap and the copy of her notes against her side and thought about other strategies and what that looked like in practice on a frontier where the nearest law enforcement was a county sheriff who was, by all accounts, a reasonable man, but spread thin across more land than one man could realistically patrol. He's right, she said. I know, said Callan. Are you worried? He considered it in this way he considered things, actually, not performatively. I'm paying attention, he said. That's different from worried. Is it? Worried is what you do when you're not doing anything. Paying attention is what you do instead. She looked at him. He was watching the road. The afternoon light caught the side of his face, and she thought, not for the first time, that he was a hard man to read. Not because he hid things, but because he was genuinely still. Still in the way that deep water is still, and you can't tell the depth from the surface. What would you do, she said, if she escalates beyond the legal claim? Depends on what she does. That's not an answer. It's the only honest one. He glanced at her briefly. What would you do? She hadn't expected the question turned back. She thought about it. I'd keep building the evidence, make the legal case so solid that anything she does physically only makes her look worse. A pause. And I'd make sure the neighbors knew what was happening before she could spin a version of it. That's a good answer. It's what my father would have done. Your father was a smart man. He was also occasionally wrong and sometimes stubborn past the point of good sense, she said. But yes, smart. Something crossed Callan's face that might have been the beginning of a smile. It didn't quite finish itself, but she was getting better at recognizing the early stages. The weeks between that conversation and what happened in January were not quiet exactly, but they were the kind of busy that felt productive rather than threatening. Tom Breck's written statement arrived 8 days later, 2 pages in a cramped, authoritative hand that was extraordinarily specific about survey markers and boundary stones and the exact methodology he'd used in 1876, and concluded with a flat declarative sentence that the boundary described in the Blackridge objection did not correspond to any survey he had conducted or documented, and that the source document cited did not exist in any record he had kept. Hare received it, read it, and sent Evelyn a note that said simply, "This is very good. Come by Thursday." On Thursday, he told them he'd filed the formal response and attached the Breck statement and the date inconsistency analysis, and that the county hearing board had set a review date for mid-February. It won't be resolved before then, he said, but the filing stops the clock on Blackridge's objection. She can't use a pending claim as leverage while it's under review. She'll find something else to use, Evelyn said. Probably, Hare agreed, but at least it won't be this. Meanwhile, the farm was changing in ways that had nothing to do with Vivian Blackridge and everything to do with what 2 capable people could build when they were actually trying. Evelyn had renegotiated the Henderson grazing arrangement in October, not confrontationally, but directly, over coffee at their kitchen table, with the actual current land valuations written on a piece of paper so the numbers could speak without anyone having to. Old Henderson had looked at the paper and looked at his wife and looked back at the paper and said, "Well, can't argue with the numbers," and they'd settled on new terms that were fair to both sides and shook hands on it. And Henderson had clapped Callan on the shoulder on the way out and said, "Smart woman you married," with no apparent irony. Callan had reported this to Evelyn verbatim that evening, and she had pretended the comment didn't land anywhere particular, which was not entirely convincing, but he had the decency not to point that out. The harvest had come in better than the previous year by a margin that Evelyn calculated, and Callan initially questioned and then stopped questioning when he saw the numbers written next to each other. She'd been right about the underused acreage. Bringing a second field into rotation had cost them labor and effort up front and returned more than the investment by the time the season closed. They were not comfortable exactly. The legal uncertainty and the cost of Hare's services were eating into the margin. But they were not struggling either, which was different from how things had looked when she'd first gone through the household accounts at the kitchen table in her second week here. The Kellerman family had started joining them for Sunday dinners once or twice a month, which had begun practically. Evelyn had helped Mrs. Kellerman with a complicated birth in November that the local doctor was too far away to reach in time, and had settled into something that felt like the early stages of genuine friendship. Their oldest son, a 15-year-old named Roy, who had more energy than purpose, had attached himself to Callan with the specific intensity of a boy who has found someone he wants to be like, which Callan handled with more patience than Evelyn would have predicted and more awkwardness than he would have preferred. "He follows you everywhere," she observed one evening. "I know," Callan said, with the tone of a man who has noticed a thing and has not yet found a way to solve it. "It's not a problem. He asked me today how I learned to shoot." What did you tell him? A pause. I told him the most important thing about shooting was learning when not to. Evelyn looked up from the ledger. That was a good answer. He looked disappointed. He'll understand it in 10 years. Callan thought about that. His father should probably be the one telling him things like that. His father is busy and tired and not particularly given to reflection, Evelyn said without criticism, just observation. You're what's available and you're doing fine. He looked at her for a moment with something she'd come to recognize as one of his more complicated expressions. Not discomfort exactly, but the look of someone receiving information they don't entirely know what to do with. You think so? I wouldn't say it if I didn't. He nodded once and went back to whatever he was sharpening, and she went back to the ledger, and the lamp burned between them. And outside the temperature was dropping in the particular way it drops in December in Wyoming, steady and serious and without apology. They moved into January. The cold arrived the way experienced people out here expected it to. Not dramatically, but thoroughly, settling into the ground and the walls and the air until everything had a hard edge to it that didn't soften until well past noon on the best days. Callan had reinforced the barn in November and laid in more feed than the previous year's accounting suggested was strictly necessary, but Evelyn had run the calculations on a hard winter scenario, and they'd agreed that the cost of being over-prepared was less than the cost of being wrong. The horses were healthy, the livestock were getting through. The house held heat better than it had looked like it would from the outside. Evelyn had started waking in the night sometimes with the sense that something was wrong, which she recognized as her nervous system working overtime on the Blackridge situation and tried not to give too much credit to. She'd lie in the dark and run through the evidence again, the way you press a sore tooth, not because it helps, but because you can't entirely stop yourself. The hearing was in February. Breck's statement was solid. Hare was good. The case was strong. She told herself these things. They were true. They didn't entirely work. On the night of January the 14th, it was clear and very cold, and she'd been asleep for perhaps 3 hours when something woke her. She lay still for a moment, trying to identify it. Not a sound exactly. More like a change in the quality of the air, something different in the smell of the house. Then she placed it. Smoke. She was out of bed before she was fully awake, which said something about the state her nervous system had been in for weeks. She pulled her coat on over her nightclothes, shoved her feet into her boots without lacing them, and opened the bedroom door into the main room. Through the front window she could see it. Not the house was fine, but the barn, the orange and the red of it, the specific wrong brightness of a structure that was burning in the black winter night. She hit Callan's door with her fist twice and didn't wait. Fire. The barn. By the time she reached the porch, he was already behind her, which was impressive and also told her he'd been sleeping lighter than she'd realized. And then there was no time for analysis because the barn was burning with the kind of committed enthusiasm that meant they had minutes, not hours, and both of them knew it. What followed was one of the worst hours of Evelyn's life, and also, in some way she would understand better later, one of the most clarifying. The cold hit her like a wall when she cleared the porch, and she stopped registering it almost immediately, which she knew was adrenaline and not warmth, and she filed it away as something to monitor. Callan went straight for the main barn door, and she went for the water, which meant the barrel near the fence that they kept filled in the summer, and which was frozen at the surface but not all the way through. She found the hand axe they kept hanging near it precisely for this reason, and broke through, and then they were both working, and neither of them had the breath for talking. The horses were out first. That was the thing that mattered most, and they got it done. The animals panicked and difficult and understandably reluctant to be led through smoke even away from it, and Callan had a long cut on his forearm from where the bay mare had shied into the doorframe in the dark that he didn't mention until much later. They got 2 of the 3 horses clear, and then the loft section went, and the bay mare was already out, so it didn't cost them an animal, but it cost them the loft and everything in it, the extra feed, the tack, the winter stores they'd put up there. They worked the water until it was clear the barn itself was gone, and the question became the outbuildings. The chicken coop was close enough to worry about. Evelyn soaked the near wall while Callan managed the water, and they saved it, though 2 of the boards were going to need replacing. Then it was a matter of standing in the freezing dark, watching the barn fall in on itself, and breathing and being too exhausted and too cold to feel anything cleanly. At some point, Evelyn realized she was shaking and couldn't tell if it was cold or adrenaline or something else. Callan put a hand on her shoulder, brief and firm, and then he was moving again, checking the house line, checking the fence near the burn. She stood for a moment and breathed deliberately and then followed. They didn't go inside until almost 4 in the morning. The kitchen felt extraordinarily warm by comparison, and Evelyn sat down at the table and her legs decided they were finished, and she let them be finished. Callan put the coffee on without discussing it. He sat down across from her and they looked at each other in the lamplight, and neither of them said anything for a little while. His face was grimy, and there was dried blood on his forearm, and he looked tired in the bone-deep way that doesn't go away with one night's sleep, and she suspected she looked worse. She could feel where her hair had come loose and was probably at angles she didn't want to think about. "The feed stores," she said finally. "Significant loss, not everything. The ground level survived." He wrapped his hand around the coffee cup. "The horses are all right. The arm. It's nothing. It's bleeding through your sleeve." He looked at his arm. "I'll deal with it." "I'll deal with it," she said, and got up before he could argue, because she needed to do something useful with her hands right then, and he clearly wasn't going to address it himself. She found the medical kit and came back, and he sat still while she cleaned it and wrapped it. And he didn't wince, which either meant it didn't hurt, or meant he was the kind of person who'd rather not admit that it did. And she'd stopped trying to determine which category most of his pain responses fell into. "Callan," she said, while she was tying off the wrap. "The fire." "I know. It started in the north end, where we don't keep lamps, where there's nothing that burns on its own." She tied the last knot and met his eyes. Someone said it. He'd already known. She could see it. He'd known from the moment he woke up, probably. Had known by the time he reached the barn door, which was why he'd moved the way he did, checking the perimeter after, instead of falling apart in front of it. "I saw tracks," he said, "in the snow along the back fence line, before it got too trampled." He held her gaze. "Boot prints. Coming from the east. Not anyone who lives east of us." She sat back down. The coffee was hot, and she held the cup without drinking it, just for the warmth. "This is what Hare meant," she said, "when he said other strategies." "Yes." She escalated. Or someone working for her did. He turned his cup in his hands. "Easier to claim distance if it's a hired man." They sat with that between them. The fire was ticking down outside, the wood settling into itself, and the cold was pressing against the windows, and the kitchen was the whole world right now. The lamp and the coffee, and the two of them sitting in the wreckage of a night that had taken a significant piece of what they'd built. "We can't prove it was her," Evelyn said. "Not yet. If we go to the sheriff with tracks and a theory, she'll have an explanation and the money to make it stick." "I know. So we need more than tracks." She set her cup down. "We need the person she hired." She looked at him. "Hired men talk. Especially when they're cold and the job went sideways and nobody's paid them yet for the part where they set a fire while a family was asleep inside." Callan looked at her with that careful expression again. "You want to find him. I want to find whoever set that fire before Vivian Blackridge makes him disappear or discredits him first." She leaned forward. "The tracks went east. Who do you know east of us that Blackridge has connection to?" He thought for a long moment. "There's a man named Cord Lassiter. He's done work for Blackridge before. Hauling, fencing, occasional other things that aren't generally discussed. He lives in a line shack about 7 miles east on the old Dutton property." He paused. "He's not a dangerous man. He's a man who does what he's paid to do and doesn't ask questions. Is he the kind of man who might regret being paid to burn down a barn with people sleeping in a house nearby?" Callan considered it seriously. If he was told it would be empty, if someone misrepresented the job to him, then maybe yes. Who would know if he was there last night? His horse would know, Callan said. A horse that ran 7 miles in January cold would need water and rest this morning. If I showed up at Lassiter's place before he's had time to do anything about that. He stopped. "You'd be showing up as a man whose barn just burned down and who's following tracks," Evelyn said carefully. "That could go badly. Or it could go the only way things go when you show up before the story is written." She looked at him. "Take Roy Kellerman." "What?" "Roy's been following you everywhere for 2 months. Use it. You show up alone, it looks confrontational. You show up with a 15-year-old boy because you needed an extra set of hands this morning. It looks like exactly what it is, a neighbor checking on something." She met his eyes. "And it means there's a witness." Callan was quiet for a moment. Then, I hate it when you're right at 4 in the morning. You could try being wrong more often and see if that helps. He looked at her then, really looked at her, the way he had on the night she'd told him she had something worth staying for. Not the closed door, the open one. Evelyn, he said. Go get cleaned up first, she said, before he could finish whatever he was going to say. Not because she didn't want to hear it, but because neither of them was in a state for it right now, and whatever it was deserved better than 4 in the morning with smoke in their hair and his blood on her hands and a collapsed barn in the yard. We'll figure the rest out when you get back. He held her gaze for just a moment longer. Then he nodded and stood and went. She sat at the kitchen table after he left, hands around her cooling coffee, listening to the sounds of the house settling in the cold, and thought about Thomas Ashcroft writing that letter in a failing hand, trusting two strangers to build something he couldn't stay alive to see. She thought about the way Vivian Blackridge had sat at this same table and offered her a comfortable exit, and how clean that offer had seemed and how hollow it had actually been. She thought about the barn, the work that had gone into it, the feed they'd stored, the winter ahead of them. Then she opened her notebook to a fresh page and started writing down everything she knew about Cord Lassiter, Dale Pruitt, and Vivian Blackridge, in the order she knew it, because Callan could handle the morning and she could handle the paper, and between the two of them they'd been managing to cover the necessary ground. The lamp burned steady. Outside, the cold sat on everything like judgment. Somewhere east, a hired man was either asleep or awake and thinking about what the night had cost him. She wrote until the sun came up. Callan picked up Roy Kellerman at first light, which meant riding to the Kellerman place in the coldest part of the morning and arriving before the boy had finished his breakfast. Roy came to the door, still chewing, saw Callan's face, and swallowed whatever question he'd been about to ask. He grabbed his coat and told his mother he'd be back by noon. His mother looked at Callan over the boy's shoulder with the expression of a woman who has learned not to ask certain questions when the neighbor's barn is smoking against the dawn sky, and Callan gave her a nod that he hoped communicated, "I will bring him back in one piece," without him having to say it out loud. They rode east in silence for the first mile. Roy was good at reading when silence was required, which was one of the things Callan had come to appreciate about him. The boy watched, listened, processed. He just did all of it out loud more than was sometimes useful. "Where are we going?" Roy asked, when the silence had settled enough that a question wouldn't break anything important. "Line shack on the old Dutton property. Man named Lassiter." "I know that place. My father says Lassiters work for hire." "That's right." Roy thought about that against what he knew about burned barns and early morning rides. He was smart enough to put it together and smart enough not to say it out loud, which Callan noted and appreciated. They rode on. The line shack sat at the end of a rutted track that nobody had maintained since the Dutton family left the territory 3 years back. It was a single room with a stovepipe chimney that was producing thin smoke, which meant someone was home and had a fire going, which meant they'd arrived before the occupant had gone anywhere. The horse tied at the post outside was breathing hard in the cold air, coat still slightly dark with dried sweat along the flanks. 7 miles in January cold. Callan looked at the horse and then at Roy and said quietly, "Wait by the horses. Don't get off yours." "What if something goes wrong, ride straight to town and get the sheriff. Don't stop." Roy looked at him with the expression of someone who wants to argue and knows better. "All right." Callan walked to the shack door and knocked. Not hard. Not the knock of someone who's angry, just a knock. The kind neighbors use. There was a pause. Then footsteps. The door opened 6 inches, which was enough for a man to look out without committing to anything, and the face that appeared was maybe 40 years old, unshaven, with the particular look of someone who had not slept well and knew exactly why. Cord Lassiter. Callan had seen him twice before at a distance and once up close at a trading post, and recognized the broad forehead and the way the man's eyes moved, always checking the edges of things, calculating exit and risk. A careful man. Not a cruel one. There was a difference, and Callan had made a career in his earlier years of knowing it on sight. "Mercer," Lassiter said. His voice was flat. Not surprised, which itself was information. "Morning," Callan said. "Your horse looks like she had a long night." Lassiter said nothing. "I had a long night too," Callan continued in the same conversational register, like they were discussing weather. My barn burned down. Want to know a strange thing? The tracks in the snow behind my property went east. About 7 miles east, near as I could figure from the stride length and the weight impression. Lassiter's jaw tightened. His eyes went to Roy briefly, and then back to Callan. I'm not here with the sheriff, Callan said. I'm here first. That means you have a window right now that you won't have later. Once I go to the sheriff, which I'm going to do, this becomes a different kind of problem for everyone involved. He paused. My wife and I were in that house last night. Something moved in Lassiter's face. Something that looked like it had been sitting uncomfortably in his chest since approximately 2 in the morning. I was told the place was empty, he said. His voice was lower. I was told you'd both gone to town for a few days. I was told it was a hay fire, for the insurance claim. Nobody said anything about... He stopped himself. Nobody said anything about a family being asleep 50 yards away. Lassiter's hand was still on the door. I need you to know I didn't... I know what you didn't do, Callan said. You didn't burn a house down with people in it. I believe that. A man who intended that doesn't ride 7 miles in January to torch a barn and then go home to sleep. He held the man's gaze steady. But you did set the fire, and you were paid to set it, and the woman who paid you has a legal case that just got substantially worse for her and is probably expecting last night to help her position. He let that sit for a second. You're the connection between her and what happened. You understand what that means. Lassiter understood. His face said so. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, and Callan could see him working through it. The math of it, the angles, where the weight fell. She'll have people say I acted alone, Lassiter said. No connection to her. Probably, unless you get ahead of it. Callan kept his voice even. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm telling you how it goes if you do nothing. Hare's already filing the legal response to her water claim. If the arson comes out, and it will come out, and you're standing alone in front of it, you're looking at a criminal charge while she watches from the other side of the territory and says she's never heard of you. Lassiter's hand dropped from the door. He turned away for a moment, one hand rubbing the back of his neck, and Callan waited because this was the kind of moment you couldn't push. It had to arrive on its own. When Lassiter turned back, his expression had changed. Not soft. This wasn't a soft man, but resolved. What do you need? A written statement. What you were told to do, who told you, what you were paid, and how. Specific as you can make it. Callan paused. And the name of whoever contacted you directly. I don't think it was Vivian Blackridge herself. No, Lassiter said. It was Pruitt. Dale Pruitt. Evelyn had pulled that name from the county filing weeks ago, the legal agent who came up from the capital for Blackridge's specialized business. The thread was pulling straight now, connecting the forged survey document to the water rights objection to the fire, all of it moving through the same hands. Will you write it? Callan asked. Lassiter looked at him for a long moment. If I write it, I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying in the territory. You'll be a witness, not a defendant. Hare will know how to position it. And if Blackridge comes after me anyway? Then you'll have neighbors, Callan said simply. It was a plain thing to say. Not a promise wrapped in conditions, not a legal guarantee, just the plain fact of it. Lassiter looked at him for another moment and then stepped back from the door. Come in then, he said. I'll write it. Callan turned briefly and caught Roy's eye. The boy was sitting very still on his horse, face composed with the particular effort of someone trying hard to look like they weren't listening to every word. Callan gave him a short nod and went inside. I was back out in 40 minutes with a 3-page written statement, specific and signed, folded into his coat pocket next to the place where Thomas Ashcroft's letter had rested on the day he first read it. Roy said nothing until they'd put a mile between themselves and the shack. Then, did you know he'd cooperate? No, Callan said. Then why? Because the other option was doing nothing, and doing nothing wasn't an option. He glanced at the boy. You ride into things that need to be done. Sometimes they go the way you hope. Sometimes they don't. But you ride. Roy was quiet for another half-mile. Then, Mrs. Mercer told you to take me along. She did. Why? Because she's smarter than I am about some things. Roy chewed on that. My mother says that about my father. He doesn't like it. Your father should pay more attention to your mother. That's what she says. They came over the rise and the Mercer farm came into view below. The ruined barn, still a dark skeleton against the white land, smoke smell still faint in the cold air. Callan looked at it and felt the loss of it. The wood he'd cut, the repairs he'd made, the specific architecture of a space where he'd spent thousands of quiet hours. It was gone. What was left was the work of rebuilding, which was a different thing, but not a lesser one. Evelyn was on the porch when they rode in. She'd changed her clothes and done something with her hair, and looked to his eye like a person who had been up all night and was refusing to let her face admit it. She watched him dismount, read something in his expression, and said nothing until Roy had headed for home with the promise of dinner at the Mercers on Saturday that Callan had no memory of offering but suspected was Evelyn's arrangement. When the boy was gone, she came down off the porch and stopped in front of Callan. He took the folded statement from his pocket and held it out. She took it. Read the first page. Read the second. By the third, her jaw had done the thing it did, set hard, but her eyes were doing something else. Bright with the specific energy of a person who has been building towards something and has just found the piece that makes it hold. Pruitt, she said, directly, named as the contact, the payment, the specific instructions. Callan watched her face. And the misrepresentation. He was told the house was empty. That matters legally, she said. It changes the charge structure. Hare will know what to do with it. We need to get to Hare today. She was already moving, folding the statement back carefully, precisely, the way she handled anything that mattered. Before Vivian knows he talked, if Pruitt figures out Lassiter is cooperating, I know. He put a hand briefly on her arm, not to stop her, just to mark the moment. We'll go, but sit down for 5 minutes first. She stopped, looked at him. You've been up all night, he said. Eat something, then we go. She opened her mouth and then she did something unusual. She closed it again without arguing. She went inside. He followed. She ate half a piece of bread standing at the counter because sitting down was apparently a compromise too far. And he ate the rest of the breakfast she'd made at some point in the dark hours before sunrise. And then they hitched the wagon and drove to town. Hare read the statement at his desk with his spectacles actually on his nose for once, which meant he was reading it as carefully as anything he'd handled in years. He set it down, picked it up, set it down again. Then he looked at them both over the rims. Where did you get this? The man who wrote it, Callan said. Is he still in the territory? As of this morning. Hare folded his hands on the desk. Evelyn, he said, which was the first time he'd used her first name, and it meant something, coming from a man who defaulted to formal address. Your date analysis on the original filing, combined with Breck's surveyor statement, already had this case pointing clearly in our direction. This, he tapped the statement, this doesn't just win the water rights hearing. This opens a criminal inquiry into Dale Pruitt and potentially into whoever directed him. Vivian Blackridge, Evelyn said. Potentially. Proving the chain of instruction is harder than proving Pruitt's direct actions. He leaned back. But the pressure this creates, on Pruitt specifically, is significant. Men like Pruitt are useful to wealthy clients right up until they become a liability. If Vivian Blackridge believes he's talking, she'll either distance herself publicly or she'll move to discredit him. Or both, Evelyn said. Or both, Hare agreed, which means we need to move quickly and we need everything documented and filed before she has time to respond. He looked at Callan. The arson itself. You'll need to make a formal report to the sheriff today, not just for the investigation, for the record. If she tries to claim any counter-narrative, you want the report date stamped before her people have time to construct one. Sheriff Aldous Cray was a methodical man in his late 50s who had the physical bearing of someone who'd once been substantially larger and had reduced over the years to a kind of concentrated toughness, like a stock that's been cooked down. He listened to Callan's account of the fire, examined the copy of Lassiter's statement that Hare had authorized them to provide, and asked 3 questions, all of them specific and sensible. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Dale Pruitt, he said. You know him? Evelyn asked. I know of him. He's come through the territory twice that I know of. He lowered his gaze from the ceiling. Both times, a property dispute resolved in Blackridge's favor shortly after. He said it without implication, just fact. I'll send a wire to the Capitol, and I'll ride out to Lassiter myself this afternoon. I want a direct statement from him, not a copy. He said he'd cooperate, Callan said. Good. Because a signed piece of paper is useful, and a man on a stand is better. Cray stood. In the meantime, is there anything about your situation out at the farm that concerns me in terms of your safety? Callan and Evelyn looked at each other briefly. The kind of look that people exchange when they've already discussed a thing privately and know where they each stand. We're watching, Callan said. Watch carefully, Cray said, and send for me if anything shifts. They left the sheriff's office in the early afternoon. The town felt different to Evelyn than it had on her first visit months ago. She recognized more faces, knew more names. Della from the dry goods store waved from across the street, and Evelyn waved back and thought about the woman crying at their wedding over what she claimed was a medical condition, and felt the particular warmth of a thing that had begun as strange and become familiar. You're thinking, Callan said beside her. I'm always thinking. You look like you're thinking about something specific. She considered telling him it was nothing, decided against it. I was thinking about the wedding, she said, Della crying, how strange it all was. He was quiet for a moment. It was strange, he agreed. Does it still feel strange? The arrangement. The question surprised even her slightly. She hadn't planned to ask it. It had just arrived in her mouth and she'd let it out before she could talk herself out of it. She kept walking, not looking at him, giving him the space to answer or not answer. No, he said. Not for a while now. She turned that over. When did it stop? He thought about it seriously because that was how he thought about things. There was a night in October, he said finally. You'd fallen asleep at the table. You'd left a lamp burning, and I came in from the barn and I saw it, the lamp in the window from outside. Before I came in, he paused. I stood there for longer than made sense. She looked at him then. He was watching the road ahead of them, face in its usual settled expression. But his jaw had the particular set of someone who has said something more vulnerable than they typically allow. I didn't know that, she said. I know you didn't. They walked in silence the rest of the way to the wagon, and neither of them said anything else about it. But when they climbed up and she was settling the reins, he reached over and briefly put his hand over hers, just for a moment, then took it back and looked at the road. It was enough. The days after that had a different quality. Not easier. The work was still enormous, and the legal battle was still in motion. But something between them had lost its last layer of formality, quietly, without announcement. They didn't talk differently. They didn't behave dramatically otherwise. But the space between them had changed its texture, and they both knew it, and neither of them needed to make a speech about it. Hare moved quickly. He filed an amended response to the water rights objection that incorporated both Breck's statement and the elements of Lassiter's account that were directly relevant to the case. He sent a separate filing to the county attorney's office flagging the date inconsistencies and the missing source document as potential fraud. And he wrote a carefully worded letter to the territory's land administration office in the capital, documenting a pattern across multiple Blackridge property acquisitions that Evelyn had helped him construct from the research she'd been doing for weeks. That research was the part Evelyn was most quietly proud of, because it had required patience and the willingness to follow threads that seemed to go nowhere before they suddenly connected. She'd spent the night since the fire, while Callan slept, and she could not, going through every public land record she could access through Hare's office and through the county files Percy had let her spend several very long afternoons in. What she'd found, taken individually, was unremarkable. What she'd found, assembled in order, was a pattern that would make any reasonable official uncomfortable. Blackridge had objected to 7 property claims in the last 4 years. 5 had been resolved in her favor. In 3 of those 5, the resolving factor had been a document, a survey, a previous filing, a title certificate, that Evelyn could not find in the originating records. Documents that appeared exactly when they were needed and whose provenance was, to use Percy's careful phrasing, unclear. She wrote it all out in a 30-page summary with every source cited and every gap documented. She gave it to Hare. Hare read it in one sitting, which she knew because he sent her a note the next morning that said, I did not sleep last night. Thank you, and also I'm sorry. Come Thursday. On Thursday, he told them that the Capitol had requested all documents related to the Blackridge land filings in the territory be held pending review. That's not a small thing, he said. That means someone up there is looking at the pattern, not just the individual case. How long will review take? Callan asked. Weeks, maybe longer. Hare turned a pen in his fingers. What it does immediately is freezes any action on her existing claims, including the water rights objection. She can't push forward on anything while the review is open. And Pruitt? Evelyn asked. The Capitol received the sheriff's inquiry. Pruitt is being asked to appear before an official in the Capitol next month. A pause. I understand he's retained counsel. Of course he has, Callan said flatly. But retaining counsel is different from having a defense, Hare said. Lassiter's statement is specific, and the sheriff found additional physical evidence at the fire site that corroborates the arson. He set the pen down. I want to be honest with you both. This doesn't resolve overnight. The wheels move at their own pace. What you've done is put the evidence in front of the right people. Now we wait for the wheels. Waiting was the hardest part. Evelyn had learned this about herself, that she was good at building a case, at working, at finding the next necessary thing, but that the space between action and outcome was where her nervous system went looking for things to worry about. She filled it with work, because work was available and worry wasn't productive, and the farm still needed running, and the barn needed rebuilding, and the Henderson boy had sprained his wrist, and Mrs. Henderson had asked if Evelyn could look in on him. The neighbors were a different thing now than they'd been in October. The fire had done something Vivian Blackridge hadn't intended. It had made the Mercer situation visible to everyone in a way that a legal dispute never quite could. People came. Old Henderson and his two sons showed up the morning after with tools and lumber and the specific silence of men who had decided something without needing to discuss it. Sutter came with two of his hired men. The Kellermans came, all of them, including Roy, who worked alongside Callan through the whole first day without once asking about shooting or anything of the kind. Della organized a supply collection from the town businesses that arrived in a wagon driven by Percy from the county office, who had apparently been wanting to do something direct for weeks. Evelyn stood in the yard on that first day of rebuilding and watched it happen and felt something so large and complicated move through her chest that she had to find a reason to go to the other side of the barn for a few minutes to collect herself, because she was not a woman who cried in public and she was not starting now. Callan found her there. He didn't ask what was wrong because he could see what was right, and he understood that sometimes right and overwhelming are the same thing. You did this, she said, not meaning the barn. We did this, he said, meaning the same thing. She pressed her lips together, nodded once. Then they went back around to the front and worked. The barn rose faster than she'd thought possible. Not perfect. The new lumber didn't match the weathered gray of the old, and the roofline came out slightly different than the original because Henderson's older son had strong opinions about pitch angles, but solid, real. Standing against the January sky with the particular stubbornness of a thing that has been knocked down and rebuilt rather than built once and never tested. It was in the second week of February that the wire came from the Capitol. Hare sent a rider out to the farm with it directly, which meant it was important enough not to wait for them to come to town. Callan was in the yard when the rider came, and he took the wire and read it, and then walked inside to where Evelyn was at the table. He set it in front of her without speaking. She read it. The Territory Land Administration had completed its preliminary review of documents related to Blackridge Ranch property acquisitions. 3 documents filed over the past 4 years had been found to be inconsistent with originating records. Dale Pruitt had been formally summoned to appear before an official inquiry, and the water rights objection filed against the Mercer property had been suspended pending the outcome of the broader investigation. Suspended. Not dismissed. Not yet. But suspended, which meant it had no legal force, which meant the water was theirs as it had always been. And the claim that had been hanging over them since October was, for now, without teeth. Evelyn read it twice, set it down. It's not finished, she said. No, Callan agreed. Pruitt hasn't appeared yet. The investigation could still go in different directions. And Vivian is going to be dealing with the fact that her legal agent is under inquiry and 3 of her land documents have been flagged, Callan said. That's a different kind of problem than the one she gave us. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, carefully, the 30-page summary I gave Hare, the pattern across the 7 filings. She looked at the wire. Someone in the Capitol read it. Someone in the Capitol read it, he confirmed. She put both hands flat on the table, breathed. My father taught me that, she said. He said, He said, if you want to stop a person who uses power like a weapon, you have to make it cost them more to keep using it than to stop. You can't out-threaten them. You have to out-document them. Callan sat down across from her. Thomas Ashcroft, he said, was a remarkable man. He was, she said. Her voice caught slightly on it, and she let it, because there was nobody here she needed to pretend in front of anymore. He would have loved this. Not the fire, not the... She gestured at the general weight of it. But this part, the documents working, he would have been insufferable about it. The good kind of insufferable? The absolute worst kind, she said. He'd have reminded me about it for years. Callan looked at her across the table, and the lamp was burning between them as it had so many evenings now. And his face had that open quality it sometimes had when he'd stopped managing his expression and just let it be what it was. What he wrote in the letter, Callan said. At the end of it, the last sentence. She remembered it. She'd memorized the entire letter, if she was honest, the way you memorize the last things people said. He said the promise was fulfilled, she said. Whatever form that takes. He trusted my judgment, Callan said, about what form it took. She met his eyes. I know. I think he knew, Callan said, better than either of us, what form it was going to take. Outside, the rebuilt barn stood in the dark against the winter sky. New wood and old land and the specific stubbornness of something that had been tried and had held. The cold was still pressing at the windows. The legal battle was still in motion. Nothing was resolved cleanly, the way nothing ever is when real people are involved. But the lamp burned steady. And across the table, Callan Mercer was looking at Evelyn in a way that had nothing practical in it at all. And she was looking back the same way. The inquiry in the Capitol took 6 weeks, which was 6 weeks of Evelyn checking the mail with a specific kind of controlled hope that she didn't let show on her face, and Callan watching her do it without comment, because he understood by now that she needed to manage her own anxiety in her own way, and that offering reassurance she hadn't asked for was not actually reassurance but just noise. Hare sent updates when he had them, which was not as often as either of them would have preferred. Pruitt had appeared before the inquiry official in late February, accompanied by counsel, and had given testimony that Hare described in his note as carefully worded in ways that suggest he is protecting someone above him while conceding the minimum necessary to avoid the most serious personal exposure. Which meant, Evelyn understood when she read it, that Pruitt was trying to land somewhere in the middle, admitting enough to seem cooperative while drawing a line between himself and Vivian Blackridge that would be difficult to cross without additional evidence. He's buying her time, Evelyn said, reading the note aloud to Callan that evening. Or buying himself a better deal, Callan said. Same thing, for now. She set the note down. The question is whether the inquiry official is satisfied with the minimum or whether they keep pulling. Hare's next note, 2 weeks later, suggested they kept pulling. A fourth document, a title certificate connected to the earliest of the 7 disputed acquisitions, had been found inconsistent with county records. And a land agent in the southern part of the territory, a man named Garrett, who had processed 2 of the Blackridge acquisitions, had been interviewed and had, according to Hare's carefully neutral phrasing, provided information that extended the scope of the inquiry considerably. Evelyn read that sentence 3 times. Then she looked at Callan. Garrett talked. Sounds like it. Which means they have more than Pruitt's carefully worded minimum. They have a second source. She felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief exactly, but the easing of a tension she'd been holding so long she'd stopped noticing the weight of it. Hare said the scope extended considerably. That means it's bigger than our water claim now, Callan said. That's what it means. He was quiet for a moment. Is that good or bad for us? For the water claim? Good. The more the inquiry is about a broader pattern, the less our case depends on anyone believing us specifically against a wealthy and well-connected opponent. She thought it through. For how long it takes, potentially slower. A bigger inquiry has more pieces to move. So we wait more. We wait more, she confirmed. Colin accepted this with the equanimity of a man who had spent years on a frontier where most things moved at speeds that had nothing to do with what you preferred. Evelyn accepted it with somewhat more effort, channeled into work, which was where she put most things that needed managing. March came in cold and then softened toward the end, the way Wyoming March does, grudgingly, incrementally, with occasional reversals that made you feel foolish for having trusted it. The new barn was settling into the landscape. The lumber was starting to weather. In another year, it wouldn't look so new, and in 5 years, nobody would be able to tell the original from the rebuilt unless they'd been there for both, which Evelyn found unexpectedly meaningful in a way she didn't entirely articulate even to herself. She and Callan had shifted over these months into a kind of partnership that had no template she'd ever seen modeled. It wasn't what her parents had been, her father gentle and deferring, her mother the quiet architect of every decision. It wasn't what she'd observed in most frontier marriages, which tended toward the transactional and often the cheerlessly utilitarian. What she and Callan had built was something she could only describe as honest, which sounded plain but wasn't. Honesty between two people requires that both of them be willing to be seen without armor, and that was not a small thing for either of them. He was still not a talker. He still went quiet when something bothered him and needed time to arrive at the saying of it, and she'd learned to leave the space for that rather than filling it, which was its own discipline for a woman whose mind ran fast and whose instinct was to move toward resolution. She was still too stubborn past the point of good sense sometimes. She could hear her father's voice saying it, and she still sometimes stayed up past midnight working through problems that would have been clearer after sleep, which Callan would occasionally point out in the morning, with a patience she did not feel she'd entirely earned. They were not a perfect pair, but they were a real one. In the first week of April, Hare sent a rider again. Not a note this time, a request for them both to come to town. Today, if possible. They came. Hare's office had more paper in it than usual, which was notable because it had always had a significant quantity of paper. He was standing when they arrived, which was also unusual. He gestured them to their chairs and then, rather than sitting himself, stood at the side of his desk with his spectacles properly on his nose for once, holding a document with both hands. "The inquiry has concluded," he said. Evelyn went very still. "Dale Pruitt has entered into an agreement with the territory's attorney. He has provided full testimony regarding the manufacture of fraudulent land documents across 11 separate property cases over the past 5 years, in exchange for reduced personal charges." Hare looked at them over his spectacles. "The testimony names Vivian Blackridge as the directing party in all 11 cases, including the water rights objection filed against this property and the instruction to Pruitt to arrange, in his words, property discouragement on the Mercer land." "Property discouragement," Callan said, very flatly. "That is the phrase used. It covered the arson." Hare set the document down. "Blackridge has been formally charged with fraud, property crimes, and conspiracy to commit arson. She is currently in the Capitol, where her legal team is engaged in the expected and substantial effort to contest the charges." He paused. "The water rights objection has been dismissed entirely. Your claim is confirmed as valid and uncontested." The office was quiet for a moment. Through the small window, Main Street went about its business, entirely indifferent to what had just been said in this room. 11 cases, Evelyn said. 11. Your documentation of the pattern across 7 was... It was the thread, Mrs. Mercer. The inquiry expanded because of that summary. The cases you identified led to the others. Hare took his spectacles off and held them in one hand. "I've been practicing law in this territory for 22 years. I've seen good evidence before. What you assembled from public records that were available to anyone who thought to look was exceptional work." Evelyn looked at the desk, at the grain of the wood, at nothing in particular. She was holding herself very carefully together in the way she had learned to do in hard moments, and she was finding it somewhat more difficult than usual. "The arson charge," Callan said, because he could see she needed a moment, and he covered for her without making it visible. "Pruitt specifically named the instruction?" "Specifically and in detail. The charge against Blackridge on that count is serious." Hare replaced his spectacles on his forehead, where they apparently preferred to live. Lassiter's cooperation was essential on that piece. His statement and the physical evidence together were enough that Pruitt had very little room to maneuver. What happens to Lassiter? Given his cooperation and the evidence that he was materially misled about the circumstances, the claim that the property was unoccupied, the territory attorney has declined to pursue charges. He's been formally released from the matter. Hare looked at Callan. "You told him he'd have neighbors. I don't know what you meant by that exactly, but I understand it was what convinced him." Callan said nothing, but something in his expression shifted. Not pride, not quite, but the look of a man who's bet on something has come back the right way. They left Hare's office an hour later after going through the remainder of the documentation, the formal dismissal of the water rights claim, the confirmation letters, the various pieces of paper that made the outcome legal and real and recorded in places where it couldn't be undone. Evelyn carried her copy folded in her coat, which was where she put things that mattered. On the street outside, they stood in the April morning, and Callan looked at her and she looked at him. "Your father's letter," he said. "I know. He called it whatever form that takes." He was looking at her steadily. "I think this is what he meant." "He didn't mean the legal case," Evelyn said. "No, I know he didn't." A pause. "Neither did I." She looked down at the street for a moment. At the mud of April, the uneven boards of the sidewalk, the entirely ordinary chaos of a frontier town going about its morning. Then she looked back up at Callan. "You held the door for me at the county clerk's office," she said. "On the day we were married. Do you remember?" He looked faintly puzzled. "I remember." "I noticed," she said. "It was such a small thing, but I was so braced for everything to be purely transactional, for it to be exactly what it said on the paper and nothing more. And then you held the door." She shook her head slightly at herself. "I filed it away and told myself not to read anything into it. And I was wrong." She met his eyes. "I should have read into it." He reached over and took her hand. Not briefly this time, just held it, on a public street in the middle of a Tuesday morning, which for Callan Mercer she was fairly certain constituted a declaration. "Thomas knew," she said. "Thomas knew," he agreed. They went to the dry goods store because they needed supplies, and life continued requiring practical things regardless of what happened inside it. And Della was behind the counter and looked at their faces and said, "Something happened, good something or bad something?" "Good," Evelyn said. Della burst into tears. "That's wonderful," she said through them. "I knew it would be. I said to my husband just last week, I said those two are going to be all right." "Della," said Callan, with the careful patience of a man who has come to accept that some people express joy through weeping and has made his peace with it. "I'm sorry," Della said, not sounding particularly sorry. "It's a medical condition." "We know," Evelyn said, and she was smiling, actually smiling, in the uncomplicated way that only comes when something that has been pressing on you for a long time finally lifts and you can feel the exact weight of it by its absence. News moved fast in a small territory. By the time they drove home that afternoon, the Kellermans already knew. Their eldest daughter waved from the fence line as the wagon passed and shouted something that Evelyn didn't fully catch but sounded celebratory. Sutter appeared at the top of his ridge on horseback and raised a hand as they came over the rise, which from Sutter was the equivalent of a speech. Roy Kellerman appeared at the farm the next morning, theoretically to help Callan with some work on the north fence, actually because he'd heard and needed to be somewhere that something significant had happened. He worked alongside Callan through the morning with a focus and a quiet that Evelyn, watching from the kitchen window, thought was the first time she'd seen him genuinely still, like he was absorbing something. At midday, she brought them food and sat on the fence post while they ate, because it was warm enough to sit outside for the first time in months, and she'd been inside since dawn and needed the air. "Is she going to prison?" Roy asked. He meant Vivian Blackridge. He'd been asking questions around that for an hour, Callan told her later, in the circling way young people ask about things they actually want to know directly. "That's for the court to decide," Evelyn said. "But she did it." "She did it." Roy chewed on that along with his lunch. "My father says some people have enough money that doing things doesn't catch up with them." "Your father isn't wrong about that as a general observation," Evelyn said. "But it's not a fixed law. It's just a tendency." She looked at the barn, the new wood, the slightly different roof line, the evidence of a winter that had been hard and survived. Money can delay consequences. It can complicate them. It can make the road longer, but it can't make something true that isn't, if you have enough time and enough patience and enough careful documentation. Roy was quiet for a moment. "You documented her." 11 cases worth, Evelyn said. Information that was available to anyone who looked. She counted on nobody looking carefully enough. "Why didn't anyone look before?" It was the right question, the important one. She looked at him, 15 years old, serious in this moment in a way he wasn't always, actually wanting to understand something rather than just fill time. "Because looking takes time," she said. And most people are busy surviving. And because she was wealthy and connected, and it was easier to accept the outcome of each individual case as just how things go sometimes. She paused. The individual pieces each looked almost reasonable. It was the pattern that was damning, and patterns require someone to hold all the pieces together long enough to see the shape. That's what you did. That's what my father taught me to do, she said. He said the most dangerous thing you can do to an unjust system is remember. Write it down. Keep the dates. Don't let time blur the details. She stopped because her voice had gone somewhere she hadn't intended. She steadied it. He was right. Roy looked at her carefully. I heard your father died last year. He did. I'm sorry. Thank you, she said, and meant it, in the simple way that you mean it when someone offers grief without embellishment or advice. Callan, she noticed, had been looking at a point in the middle distance through this entire conversation, not absent, listening, just not inserting himself into something that was going the right way without him. April moved through itself and into May, and the territory dried out and the planting began, and the farm expanded its second-year rotation into the third field as Evelyn had been planning since November. It was more work than they could comfortably do alone, and they weren't alone. Cord Lassiter, who had spent the months since his statement in a kind of uncertain limbo, appeared at the farm one Saturday in early May, with his horse and his tools, and an expression that was roughly equal parts shame and determination. I'm looking for work, he said to Callan. Fair wages. If you'll have me. Callan looked at him for a long moment. Evelyn, who had come out onto the porch, watched and didn't speak because this was Callan's call, and she knew it. You can start Monday, Callan said. I'll feed you at noon. The wage is what I paid the Henderson boy last year, adjusted. Lassiter nodded. Something in him that had been braced relaxed. Thank you. Don't thank me, Callan said. Work. It was not a gracious acceptance, and it was not meant to be. But Lassiter showed up Monday, and he worked, and he was good at it. And over the weeks he became a regular presence on the property in the unceremonious way that people sometimes integrate themselves into a situation they'd previously damaged, not by being forgiven in any formal sense, but by simply being useful and consistent until the history of the thing stopped being the loudest fact about them. Evelyn watched this process with the complicated feeling of a woman who had not forgotten what that fire had cost them and was choosing, deliberately, to measure the future against a different set of scales than the past. It wasn't easy, it wasn't complete, but it was a choice she made consciously, which she thought was the only honest kind of forgiveness. Not the spontaneous kind that arrives fully formed, but the kind you decide on, and then maintain even on the days you don't feel like it. The news from the capital came in pieces over the following months. Pruitt's agreement with the territory attorney finalized in June, with the reduced charges as agreed. The criminal case against Vivian Blackridge moved through its preliminary stages with the methodical slowness that legal things move when the defendant has significant resources and is using all of them. There were delays, there were motions. Hare kept them informed without dramatizing it, which Evelyn appreciated. What happened in July was not dramatic in a legal sense, but felt, to everyone who had watched the preceding year unfold, like the conclusion that the whole thing had been moving toward. Vivian Blackridge's legal team filed a request for an extended continuance, a delay, citing the complexity of the case. The request was denied. 3 days later, Vivian Blackridge reached a settlement with the territory. Full admission of fraud across 9 of the 11 cases, voluntary forfeiture of properties acquired through fraudulent means, a substantial financial penalty, and a formal agreement to leave the territory and not return. She did not go to prison. That was the imperfect part, the part that sat in Evelyn's chest with a particular edge to it. A woman with fewer resources would almost certainly have faced confinement. The settlement was what money could buy when the evidence was too solid to fight, but the defendant could still negotiate the form of the consequence. Hare told them in his office, same room, same chairs. When he finished, Callan was quiet. Evelyn looked at the window. It's not everything, she said. No, Hare agreed. It's not. The properties acquired fraudulently, the families she displaced. Some can be reclaimed. Some have moved on, sold what was taken from them at a loss, rebuilt elsewhere. Not all of it can be reversed. He said it honestly, without softening it. That's the other imperfect part. Is there any recourse for those families? Civil claims. Some will succeed, some won't. It depends on circumstances. He looked at her. The criminal case established the fraud. That gives the civil cases a foundation they wouldn't have had otherwise. Your 30 pages gave the inquiry the pattern it needed to make that case. She thought about that. About the families she'd never met, whose situations she'd read in county records as entries in a pattern, who would now have standing in court they hadn't had before. It was indirect, it was incomplete, and it mattered more than the specific outcome for the Mercer water claim had ever mattered. All right, she said, not pleased, but resolved. Vivian Blackridge left the territory in August. Evelyn didn't see her go. She didn't need to. She was in the North Field with Lassiter and Roy, who had taken to helping on weekends in an arrangement that his father had initially been uncertain about and had eventually accepted on the grounds that the boy came home working harder and talking less, which Henderson attributed to Callan's influence and which Evelyn suspected was only half the explanation. She found out Vivian had left when Della mentioned it, the same way most things found their way around Pet. Through ordinary conversation in an ordinary place, the information landing in passing. Gone for good, they're saying, Della told her, wrapping a parcel of cloth Evelyn had ordered. Sold the Black Ridge Ranch last week. New family coming up from Kansas. What kind of family? Young couple. 3 children. They're going to run cattle. Della passed the parcel over the counter. I think it'll be nice for a fresh start on that land. Evelyn paid for the cloth. Yes, she said. I think it will. She drove home in the late August afternoon with the windows of the wagon open to the warm air and the smell of the high summer grass coming off the hills. And she thought about fresh starts and the strange nature of how they happen. Not cleanly, not with ceremony, but gradually and incompletely, like the way a scar becomes part of your skin without you noticing exactly when. The farm was in the best shape it had been in years, which was a fact she could measure in numbers, and also in the quality of the evening light on the rebuilt barn, and the sound of Lassiter finishing up near the fence line, and the smell of dinner she'd put on before leaving, which would be ready and imperfect in exactly the way her cooking was always imperfect because she was adequate at it, exactly as she'd told Callan on the wagon the first day, and no better. Callan was on the porch when she came back, sitting in the chair that had always been there, the one that had looked empty to her the first time she'd seen it, and now looked like his chair, which was a small and significant distinction. He watched her bring the wagon in and didn't get up until she was handling the horse, and then he came and took the bridle because that was how they did it, without discussion, each thing falling to whoever was already positioned for it. Long day? He asked. Productive, she said. Della says Black Ridge is gone. I heard. He finished with the horse, looked at her in the evening light. How do you feel about it? It was the kind of question he'd learned to ask over the past year, the asking of which had cost him something because he wasn't a man who'd spent much of his life asking people how they felt. She'd watched him learn it the way you watch someone learn a physical skill, imperfectly, with effort, occasionally abandoning it and then returning. Relieved, she said, and aware that relieved isn't the same as satisfied. She considered. My father would have felt the same. He'd have said something like, the law is a tool, not a conscience. Tools do what you use them for and nothing more. He'd also have said you used it well, Callan said. She looked at him. You didn't know him well enough to know what he'd have said. I knew him well enough, Callan said, simply. She thought about that, about Thomas Ashcroft describing this man in letters over the years. Not extensively, not effusively, but with the specific confidence of someone who had taken a full measure and was sure of it. She thought about the letter written in a failing hand, about whatever form that takes, about 2 strangers who had been handed each other by a dying man's trust and had built, from that unlikely starting point, something neither of them had planned. I want to visit his grave, she said, before winter. I keep meaning to, and then there's always something. We'll go, Callan said. Next week, if the weather holds. She nodded. They went inside. Dinner was imperfect and sufficient, and they ate it at the table they'd shared for nearly a year now, and outside the summer evening was long and golden in the way of high summer evenings that make the hardness of the preceding winter feel almost abstract. Roy had left a hammer on the porch that he'd forgotten, which was irritating and also inevitable, and Evelyn put it just inside the door where he'd find it Saturday. Lassiter had fixed the section of fence near the creek that had been leaning all spring and hadn't mentioned it, just done it, which she considered a good sign about the kind of worker he was becoming. The wooden box was still on the shelf above the kitchen window. It had been there since the third week, when Evelyn had taken it out of her room and set it in the common space without entirely deciding to. She looked at it sometimes and felt the grief of it, and also, increasingly, felt her father's presence in this kitchen in a way that had nothing to do with sadness, more like the sense of someone who has kept their promise and is quietly pleased about it. After dinner, Callan said, "I want to show you something." She followed him outside into the last of the evening light. He walked her past the barn, past the new fence line, out to the edge of the north field where the third rotation planting was coming in thick and green in the August warmth. He stopped there and looked at it. "Last year this was unworked ground," he said. "I know. I was the one who argued for rotating it." "I know you were." He was looking at the field. "I stood here in the fall when we first broke it, and I thought, I don't know. I thought about the previous 11 years here, what the farm looked like, what it was." He paused in the way he did when he was making sure of what he was going to say next. "It's different now, not just the field." "I know," she said softly. "Thomas wrote that I needed—" He stopped, started again. "He said maybe you." Those were his words. At the end of the letter, not a statement, maybe. He finally looked at her. "I've been thinking about that word. Why he left it uncertain." "He left it uncertain because it wasn't his to decide," Evelyn said. "He could put us in proximity. He couldn't make it be anything. But he thought it could be. He thought we were the kind of people who might let it." She looked at the field, then at him. "He was right. We are." Callan was quiet for a moment. The summer evening stretched long and warm around them, and the field was green in the fading light, and somewhere behind them, the barn stood solid and real. "I'm glad you didn't take Vivian's offer," he said. "The job, the exit. I'm glad too. I don't know what I would have done." He said it with the particular difficulty of a man admitting something he's thought about many times. "I know I would have managed. I always manage. But it would have been—" He found the word. "Diminished." She looked at him fully. "Callan." "What?" "Stop trying to say it sideways," she said. "Just say it." He looked at her, and then, because he was a man who did the necessary thing when he'd made up his mind about it, he said it straight. "I love you," he said. "That's the thing I've been trying to find the edges of for about 6 months, and I've given up trying to be careful about it. I love you." It was not elegant. It was not carefully constructed. It arrived with the same directness he applied to fence posts and legal testimony, and it landed exactly as true things land when they're finally said out loud after a long time of being true quietly. Evelyn felt the tears come and did not, for once, root them away. She let exactly 2 of them go, then she was herself again, steady, clear-eyed, fully present. "I know," she said. He blinked. "You know, I've known for a while." She almost smiled. "I was waiting for you to get there. You could have said something." "You needed to arrive at it yourself," she said. "My father told me that about you, years before I ever met you." Something moved across his face, surprise and grief and warmth all at once, the complicated arithmetic of being known by someone who is no longer here to see what that knowledge made possible. "Thomas," he said. "Thomas," she agreed. He reached out and tucked a piece of her hair behind her ear with the awkward, careful gesture of a man who doesn't do small, tender things easily and is doing one anyway. She took his hand when he lowered it and held it, standing in the field her father had trusted them to tend. The stars were coming out. The rebuilt barn stood at their backs. The north field stretched green and full in front of them, the evidence of 2 people working ground that neither of them had worked well alone. Somewhere in the territory, a legal process was finishing itself out, and other families were finding their footing, and a young couple from Kansas was preparing to begin something on land that had held cruelty for years and would now hold something different. None of it was complete. None of it was clean. The legal system had done what legal systems do: imperfect tools in imperfect hands, producing imperfect outcomes that were nevertheless better than nothing, and sometimes better than that. The farm was not a finished thing. They were not finished people. There would be hard winters ahead, and disagreements, and days when the work outpaced the strength, and moments when the grief of the past resurfaced without warning. But they were standing in a field they'd brought to life together, and the stars were out, and Thomas Ashcroft had written a letter in a failing hand and trusted two stubborn, imperfect, capable people to know what to do with the time he'd bought them. They knew. That was enough. That was, in the end, everything.